Thank you very much, Devana. I am thrilled to be here. I want to start by thanking the Schweinfurth for having me here today and for having my exhibit. I'm beyond excited that my quilts are hanging. And it's really, this is not exactly true, but it's one of the first times that somebody else hung them all for me. I didn't have to climb up on the ladders or anything. It was great. So anyway, I'm thrilled. I've loved quilting by the lake, and for a couple of years before I was brought on to teach, I did take classes, and I would also, not that we're plugging or anything, but for anybody who hasn't had the opportunity to take a class at QBL, I think we're going live again next summer, and it's a great experience. Anyway, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm here to talk a little bit about my family and the quilts in my family and how having those quilts in my personal life and in my creative life has affected my work. I think I'm going to be talking about 3 of my 4 mothers tonight. And the work of one of them is behind me now. These quilts were both made by Lavinia, who is my great-grandmother on my father's side, my father's maternal grandmother. And I actually am fortunate enough to have many of her quilts, which I will talk about in a minute. So what I'm going to do is to share my screen. If you'll allow me just a moment for that awkward thing where we try to get the technology to work properly. Okay, this is a photograph from the current exhibit at the Schweinfurth. I think it runs through August 7th, maybe something like that. The Schweinfurth is in the Finger Lakes area of upstate New York. It's quite beautiful. And it's a long drive if you're in California, but if you're anywhere closer and you want to come and take a look, there's lots of other lovely things to do there. It's very pretty. I drove up recently to deliver the quilts, and I consider myself now an expert. Anyway, so this is a photograph from the exhibit, and this is a particularly touching photograph for me because it contains the work of 2 of my grandmothers. The 2 lone stars that you see on the wall were made by my great-grandmother, Lavinia. And then the basket quilt that you see on the bed was made by my great-great-grandmother, Jane Arthur Bond. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about all of them this evening. The quilt that's on I'll tell the story of how I got both of these quilts, actually, or all 3 of them. So let's go on. So let's talk about quilting. I made my first quilt in 1979, and this is a picture of it. It's a Goose in the Pond quilt. And I made it between my junior and senior years in college. And I came home and I was, working the job, but I was also working on this quilt. And my mother came into the sewing room, the guest room, as I was working on this. And she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm making a quilt." And she looked at me and she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, I want a quilt, but I'm not really sure, what's pushing me, but I'm really feeling pushed to do this. And so that's why I'm doing it." And, she was fine with that. And, but really, when I thought about it a little bit later, I realized that I really was feeling impelled to make this quilt. My mother did not make quilts. Nobody in the generation directly above me that I knew of was making quilts. So that question lingered as to really why I was making the quilt. I was always a maker as a child. We sort of cornered the market on construction paper at my house. And, there was a lot of cut and paste. That was my big strong point. And when you think about it, for a person who likes to cut things up and put them back together, quilting was sort of a natural conclusion. So after I was working on these, making this quilt, and I made a couple of quilts after that, I stumbled across this book, and it's called Stitched from the Soul, and it's slave quilts from the antebellum South. And so I'm flipping through this book, and I see this picture of Jane Arthur Bond. And I said, now, wait a minute, because I knew that Jane was our, original matriarch. She is sort of the mother of us all in our family. But I didn't know what this had to do with quilting. Jane was born in 1828. She was born a slave, and she was born in Anderson County, Kentucky. She was not only a slave and the property of Ambrose Fletcher Arthur, but we think probably she was also the daughter of Ambrose Fletcher Arthur. And when Ambrose's white daughter was married in, I think it was 1848, she was married to Preston Bond. Jane was sent along as a wedding gift. And during the time that Jane was enslaved by Preston and Belinda, she had at least two sons that we know of, and possibly more. Two sons by Preston. James was born in 1863, and Henry was born in 1865. And in our family, you're either a James or you're a Henry. I am a Henry, and Henry was my great-grandfather. And then after the end of the Civil War, Jane moved back to Anderson County. And when her children were of an age where they had finished all the schooling that was available to them where they lived, she sent them off to Berea. And I don't know how many of you maybe know a little bit about Berea. At the time, Berea was a secondary and higher education institution, and it was run by abolitionists, and it had both Black and white students. So James went off to Berea and went through his secondary and his college education and graduated and went on to Oberlin College to get his degree in divinity. And Henry went on to a couple of years after James, and he did not finish at Berea. He came home. I think Jane was sick is the story. So he had to come home and take care of his mother. And he went back in Anderson County, was a school teacher and a lawyer. And I'll tell you a little bit about his wife in a little bit. So clearly Jane was strongly motivated to get her son's education. She could not, of course, read or write. And she did learn when she was much older. But it was very important to her for her sons to go to school. When she was in Anderson County, she worked for Rebecca Bond Root, who actually was Preston's sister. And she lived with Henry in Whitley, Kentucky, and she died in 1920. Oops, sorry. So the whole quilt thing. So Jane, as I learned from this book, made quilts. And the reason that we know this, I'm going to flip back for a little bit. The reason that we know that Jane made quilts is because this young girl here, who was Rebecca's daughter, as she grew up, she was a diarist, and she wrote about many things in her life. And among the things that she wrote about were Jane and the quilts that Jane made for and with her mother. So this young woman here is the reason that we actually know all of this quilting parts of Jane's history. And her granddaughter, so the granddaughter of this young girl, made contact with the woman in our family, on the Brown side of the family, who did genealogy, and they connected. And this is Emma. Emma's the one who used to do genealogy in our family. This is me, much younger. And this is a quilt that Jane made. And when Catherine, who was the granddaughter of that girl, talked to Emma and found out we were interested in quilts. Well, I was. She sent this quilt that Jane had worked on with Rebecca. And she sent it to one of our reunions, and we got to, you know, look at the quilt and touch the quilt and everything. We had to send the quilt back. But anyway, we got to see this quilt, and, you know, we sort of continued this conversation with Catherine. And I reached out to Catherine and I said, you know, I'm a quilter and I would like to see these quilts. And so I went down to Florida where she lives, and I saw these quilts that you see over on this side. And this one that you see here is the same quilt that appears in that book, Stitched from the Soul. And I don't know if I have a picture of that here. No, I don't. Okay. So that quilt I had, from the picture in the book, I had duplicated that quilt. I had made a new version. And so I invited Catherine to come to our reunion that we had in Philadelphia. I hosted in Philadelphia in 2008. And she brought this quilt, the one in the foreground. And she put it up for auction to support the reunion, and I got it. So I now own that quilt, and that's the one that's on the bed in the exhibit. And I was so, you know, excited. There was a part of me that couldn't believe she didn't give us, you know, half of the quilts at least, but I got one. So I was, you know, happy to have that one. And I'm so happy to see it in the exhibit alongside the others. So there's other Bonds in the family that are more famous than Jane. You see on the right, Julian Bond, who was Julian was a grandson of Jane's, and his father, Horace Mann Bond, over here, was the first Black president at. I'm blanking for a minute. The first Black president at a Black university in outside of Philadelphia. I'm going to come up with it as soon as I flip here. But anyway, we have, you know, a number of famous folks in our family. But for me, Jane is one of the most famous for me. So here's a picture of Henry. Henry was Jane's second son by Preston, and he's my great grandfather. And this is, to the right, is a picture of Anna, who was his wife. Henry met Anna at Berea, and he brought her back home when he returned, and she married him and had 10 children with him. She was the daughter of a minister, and when she came back to Anderson County with him, she taught school, and in the course of 18 years, she had 10 children, and she also made quilts. So anytime I ever feel like I'm overdoing it, or, you know, people will say, oh, how are you so prolific that you make all these quilts? And I just think about Anna, and she made 10 human beings and a bunch of quilts with far less resources than I have. So I always think of her if I'm feeling tired or put upon. These are some quilts that Anna made. And there's a funny story about the one on the left. When I first became associated, you know, with modern quilting, or, you know, started going to Modern Quilt Guild meetings, I went on Facebook because I was trying to figure out, you know, so what is this modern quilting? Why is one thing modern and another thing is not modern? So I jumped on this Facebook group to sort of try to figure out the answer to that question. And I posted a picture of a quilt that I had made. And I asked, you know, is this modern or is this not modern? What makes it modern? What makes it not modern? And, you know, a sort of a lively, pleasant discussion ensued. And then all of a sudden it disappeared. And I was you know, a little astonished. And I asked the administrator, you know, what happened to that quilt? And she said, oh, well, we determined that it was not a modern quilt, and so we deleted it. And I said, oh. So, I was feeling a little salty about that. So this quilt on the left, I said, well, I wonder if they think this is modern. So I posted this quilt and I said, is this a modern quilt? And a number of people said, oh my, yes, it is, because it is a non-traditional grid layout, and because it's asymmetrical, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I said, oh, that's funny, because it was made by my great grandmother. And then they called me a troll and they kicked me out of the group. But I still am associated with modern quilting, but I do believe that, there's nothing really new under the sun in quilting. And there are just a lot of people who do quilting in many different ways. And whatever it is that we're doing, someone has done it before. That's just what I think. So then I continued quilting and reading, and I came across this book in the bargain bin of at a quilt shop near my home. And I'm flipping through this, and I see this picture of Ruth Clement Bond. And I said, now, wait a minute. I know her, just like I knew Jane. I said, what in the world does she have to do with quilting? And a little bit about Ruth. She is not actually a foremother, technically, of mine. She was married to Max, who was one of Jane's grandsons. He was a James rather than a Henry. And he married Ruth, and he took a job with the Tennessee Valley Authority as a training officer. Because of course one can't have, in those days, the white workers and the black workers working together on these projects. They had to split them up. So they needed a smart guy to supervise the black workers. And so Max got that position. And Ruth went along with him to, learn some things, to work with some of the women in some of the camps. And she designed quilts. Ruth was not a quilter herself. She did not make the quilts, but she did design them. And she designed this one during her time at the Tennessee Valley Authority. And this quilt is called The Lazy Man. And many people look at this and say that it's reminiscent of the work of Jacob Lawrence. Ruth was, an educated woman and a worldly woman, and she certainly was aware of art that was being produced by African-American artists at the time. And so it may very well have been inspired by them. This was stitched up by one of the women in the collective, and it now hangs at the headquarters of the Tennessee Valley Authority. But it also, in the year 2000, when a bunch of quilting folks got together to choose the best quilts of the 20th century, this is one of the quilts that was chosen. So very proud of Ruth. And I happened also, these are some of the other quilts that she designed that were stitched by some of the other women. And you can see that she is, doing a lot of subject matter around power and electrification and building. And this is a picture of Ruth in front of one of the versions of this quilt that was made. There were several. And this is actually how I remember Ruth. And I saw Ruth in, I think it was probably in 1996, we had a reunion in Greensboro. And I brought the book with me and sat down with her. And it was so funny. She said, my goodness, I haven't thought about that in years. So this thing that in the quilt world is fairly prominent and famous, she had almost forgotten about it because it had been so long. And because, she had done so many other things in her life. She was a social justice warrior from way back. And she she was a phenomenal woman. And then there was Lavinia. And Lavinia was my father's maternal grandmother. She was born in 1858 near Orangeburg, South Carolina. And, you know, it was only a few years ago, that I actually stopped to think that she was born in 1858 and I was born in 1958. So here I was, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I had been sort of working on quilts that were coming from her work. And so here we were a century apart doing the same work, which, you know, I find very inspiring. Anyway, she married Esmond Cleckley in 1882, and they had 2 children, Bertha, and then the younger one was Rosabelle, and Rosabelle was my grandmother. Lavinia was a prolific quilter. She made many quilts in her lifetime, and my father, I asked him, there were quilts on the beds when I was growing up, and I asked him who had made them. And at the time he said it was his grandmother, and I didn't really think much about it. But subsequently he told me a few stories, one of which was that his mother, Rosabelle, had always felt that Lavinia had preferred her older sister, Bertha. And this, you know, was a feeling of some intensity. And so when Lavinia died in 1943, Rosabelle went over and got all the quilts that she could find before Bertha got there. And so these are the quilts that had been on the beds when I was young. And there were probably, you know, 4 or 5 that I remember. When my father died in 1996 and we were cleaning out the basement, we found 10 quilts that we had never seen before. And it was almost as though he was still hiding those quilts from Bertha's people. So that is why I have so many of Lavinia's quilts. And I guess that's probably part of the reason why she became a subject for me with respect to my own work. A little more about Lavinia and Esmond. Esmond was my father's grandfather. And when my grandmother was dying, when Rosabelle was dying, she had a journal, and my father had her writing things down. You know, it's a funny thing about history and family history. I think that we often, as younger people, are not that interested in it. And it's not until we get older and we, you know, get a relationship with our own mortality that we start to wish that we had asked a bunch of questions. And so my father asked his mother, you know, to write things down. And so she did write a few things down. There were a couple of sentences that I remember looking at. One of them was, she said her father told her that they were never slaves, that he and his siblings were never slaves. And it was a love match between his mother and his father. And then she wrote down that his father was named Rufus Cleckley. So a few years later, you know, upon establishing a relationship with my own mortality and becoming interested in history, I jumped onto Ancestry.com and I decided, well, let me see, you know, what I can find. And I was astonished at how much I was able to find. And so I had these couple of sentences written by Rosabelle, and I did find Rufus Cleckley. I had already found Lavinia, but I found Esmond Cleckley, and then subsequently I found Rufus Cleckley. And, you know, I thought to myself, I wonder if I can really ever determine, you know, the thing that Rosabelle had written. So I looked at the 1860 census, and this is, you know, a little blown up piece of the 1860 census, but you'll see this is the slave property schedule This is the property schedule of Rufus Cleckley. So here's Rufus Cleckley down here. And these are his property. One black female, 25 years old. One mulatto female, 8 years old. One mulatto male, 2 years old. And one black man, 59. I'm not sure. I don't know who that is. So I thought, well, isn't that interesting? But then I went to 1870 to find what was going on then. And here's the census in 1870. And this is, of course, after the Civil War, excuse me. So here's Rufus again, Rufus Cleckley. He's 42 now, and he is a railroad agent. At this point, Julia, who was Esmond's mother, had died. But here we have Emma, 17. Now, this same person was a piece of property on the slave schedule. In 1860, she was an 8-year-old girl. Esmond, who is my great-grandfather, he is now, instead of being 2 years old, he's 12. And here it says he's attending school. So these people who were, you know, property in 1860, according to the federal government, were now children. They were Rufus's children, this white man with these brown children, and they're listed on the property as children. And so it's amazing to me that I was able to find here that, yes, this was a family, you know, and the things that my grandmother had said about it being a love match, they being a family, that they were never property, was true. And here I have it written down. You know, the census could not see those children in 1860 as children, but by 1870, that's what they were. Okay, so let's talk about Lavinia's quilts. This is a blazing star. Now, I'm using that terminology. Of course, we know in different areas of the country or in different, you know, decades or centuries, there are a lot of different names that are associated with particular patterns. You know, sometimes what we call a lone star is called a Star of Bethlehem. There's lots of different names, but the one that I'm familiar with and am going to be using is the Lone Star. So this I'm calling a blazing star because at the point of each of the blades of this interior star, there is another triptych, sort of a little triple blade here at the end of each one, so that you get this whole huge, blazing, amazing thing. And this quilt is hanging in the exhibition. And it's in remarkably, you know, good condition for being what must be, you know, over 100 years old. It's clear that it was made, you know, lovingly and purposefully, not only to be a beautiful thing, but also to express the creativity of its maker, who was Lavinia. Here's some other quilts that she did. This one I spent some time calling it a Carolina lily, but with a little bit of research, I found that it's actually a peony. And as a matter of fact, 2 years ago when I taught at the Vermont Quilt Festival, there was a whole exhibition of peony quilts. You know, fate loves me. It loves to put these things in my path. So this is a peony, and this is one of Lavinia's quilts. She was, again, as I said, quite prolific. Okay, this is one of Jane's quilts. This is a Irish chain, and it's block based. Obviously, lots of little blocks. And oh, okay, all right. So here are the quilts that have come from a block-based pattern, but these are my quilts. And I like a busy quilt. I like a big quilt, but I like a quilt with a lot going on. And this is got those little checkerboards here, but then we've got these spikes that are going around it just to make things a little bit more interesting. And then because this had 36 blocks, and by the time I got to 30, I decided I wanted to do something different. So now we also have these rounded versions, which later on, after I got them together, started to look like Minesweeper blocks back from the old days when that was all we had to do on our phones instead of live our whole lives on them like we do now. This one is also a block-laced quilt. If you look at it carefully, it's really a 9-patch, a large 9-patch, but it has, you know, lots of detail to it. So the horizontal and vertical pieces here have some pieced interests, some strips of piecing. The centers have something interesting, either some little triangles here or some other piecing. I've done this quilt a couple of times, and sometimes I use sort of a larger pattern fabric, you know, print, and those are nice to put in these sort of 6-inch spaces here. Where are you? Oh, there you are. And then these corner pieces have just half square triangles in them. And it sort of, you know, gives you a lot of interest, but they work up pretty quickly, which is fun. And in this quilt, I was sort of playing around not only with the color, but also with mixing colors, bright colors, with these more neutral pieces over here. This was sort of the start of my interest in neutral colors. Here's another workup on those neutrals. Again, the same pattern, but all in these grays and blacks and whites. Here's Anna and her sort of columny strippy quilt. And this is a quilt that I made actually at Quilters by the Lake, Quilting by the Lake. I took a class with Nancy Crow, and it was a 5-day class. And this was the quilt that I worked up in that class. And it's along the same sort of infrastructure as Anna's quilt. It's made in columns, and just a lot of lessons with color and light and progressions of colors and interrupting those progressions with other things, and how does that draw the eye across the quilt. This one was a lot of fun. And so after doing this quilt, or the one previously, I did another one, but this one with more prints. This has a lot of Dutch wax prints, and it has bogolan or mud cloth. It has a very sort of fixed columnar design, which sort of reminds me a little bit of kente cloth or some of the fabrics that come from Guatemala that are done on the backstrap loom. So people are weaving these narrow pieces of cloth and then sewing them together into a larger piece. This is also from that same technique of making strips of fabric, although this one is done in triangles. And then the triangles are put together into squares and put together that way. But the same, again, the same lessons of color. And then this one was pieces that were left over from the large quilt previously. And they were just so pretty that I couldn't just throw them away. So I put them together with linens and some other woven fabrics, some of them ikat, other kinds of fabrics. And they came together in this, which is actually a much smaller quilt, but which I love very much. And it reminds me of Anna's quilt as well. Okay, here we come back to Lavinia again. So at some point, probably a couple of years ago, I decided that I wanted to focus on these quilts that Lavinia had made. I feel, I guess, a little bit more closely associated with Lavinia in terms of her work. And it's probably because I have so much of her work. And I'm able to, really sort of get to it close up and really look at it and think about it. So this is one of the first variations on the Lone Star that I was working on. And this one is, I call this an inverted star. So I've taken those points, and instead of, focusing on an outward arrangement where the points are reaching out of the quilt, here they're reaching towards the center of the quilt. And I also decided to make the diamonds that are coming towards the center of the quilt different angles. So the black and white diamonds are 45-degree diamonds, but the red and white diamonds are 30-degree diamonds. And so it's a little bit hard to really see that when you're looking at the quilt, but I think that it does create sort of a little bit more tension and a little bit more interest when you're looking at the quilt. And then I said, well, let me take those same diamond blades, those all that are made of all these diamonds put together. And instead of, again, circling them around the center of the quilt to make them into a traditional Lone Star, what would happen if I lined them up across the quilt? And so that's what I did. And this is Lavinia's lateral Lone Star. And I love this. This is it's sort of dynamic. In terms of the coloring, it's modern. Although I will say that after I made this quilt, I did look at through some books of antique quilts, and, this has been done before, as I mentioned, by, some women 10 or 100 years ago had the same idea, which is really not a huge surprise. But then I took those same blades, those diamond blades, and I decided to stretch them out a little bit and put a little something in between them to give me another variation. And so this one is called Diamond Stair Step. And in addition to sort of stretching them out, I use slightly different background fabrics in the different rows. And so it gives it this almost 3D effect. So this is another one of the Lone Star variations. And then this is the latest one. This is the same, again, we see the same diamonds, and we've stretched them out and separated the rows of diamonds with other fabric. But here they're sort of opposing one another, and they've turned into this sort of chain link. And I live in the city, and the chain link fence is pretty ubiquitous, and it's a visual that I really like. And so I was sort of charmed by this idea. And so I made this quilt. And it reminds me, it's funny. So sometimes I say when I'm giving a talk and I want to be sort of impressive, I will say that when I was looking at this, I wanted to create the image of, the urban tree that grows, and then the sunlight shows through the leaves, and you get this dappling effect of the light, on the chain link. And really the truth is that I ran out of one of the background fabrics. And so I put in the lighter one also. So, as an afterthought, that's a good story. But the truth is I was improvising because I ran out of the first background that I had chosen. So one of the things that that I find, in my life with quilting, and I say this to students all the time when I'm teaching, is that, we quilt to create a balm for the things that trouble us in life, right? you have a tough day at work, or you know, whatever it is, this quilting thing that we do, you know, brings us peace. It brings us, you know, something to sort of relieve the anxiety or the tension or the whatever it is that is troubling in life. And certainly there's no lack of inspiration coming from that area. But I was intrigued when I was reading this quote from Bell Hooks, who was writing in Aesthetic Inheritances, History Worked by Hand, when she was talking with her grandmother about what quilting was for her. And she had, you know, seen her grandmother, and she had seen the community that was created around quilting, and the relationships that were fostered among these women under the auspices of quilting. And she said that her grandmother had told her that quilting was this aspect of a countrywoman's world, which enabled her to cease attending to the needs of others and come back to herself. And I think that that's something, certainly for me, that quilting does. It allows us to focus on our thoughts, our visions of what can come from this fabric that's running through our hands. And this is something that, you know, through working with Luvinia's quilts and thinking about her work and thinking about this Black woman who was born into slavery, who raised 2 children, who lived her entire life in the South, in South Carolina, and lived a life with which, you know, must have been full of challenges that, you know, that were unjust. And yet she, you know, made the place in her life, not only to make these quilts, these bed coverings, but to make things that were specific to her, to make things that expressed her own creativity and her own aesthetic. And the fact, you know, the condition on these quilts leads me to believe that she treasured them after she made them, and that these, you know, were imbued with her own spirit and something that she wanted to preserve. And so I want to preserve those things as well. And I'm just so thrilled to see them now in the Schweinfurth, you know, hanging for people to see, and, you know, reminding us all and furthering the memory of these women who, you know, managed things in those days that we're still managing today, really, truthfully. So that's the talk. That's what I have to say. I thank you all for listening and letting me put all that out there.
You are welcome to, you know, unmute yourself and ask your question. And
was it hard for your great-grandmothers to afford fabric?
You know, I don't know exactly, because I did not know Luvinia. I did not know Jane. I imagine it was. When I look at Luvinia's quilts, you know, I do have some that are older and more utilitarian, and they definitely show signs of maybe having been made from fabric that was left over from things. I can't tell whether she bought new fabric for these quilts. Clearly, she had a very specific color scheme in mind, and you know, wanted to, you know, create this vision. When I look at Jane's quilt, it's interesting. It took me a while to figure out what the design of this quilt was, because the different fabrics faded out differently. So her quilt is, you know, a good bit older. It's maybe 150 years old. And many of those fabrics have faded out completely. So there is not even one I don't think, one of the baskets on that quilt that has all its color left in all of the pieces. And I had to actually elicit some help to look at it to try to figure out what the pattern was. So I think that Jane's quilt did reach to more sources for the colors. So she had blues from various different fabrics. Some of them were more color fast than others. Most of the quilts that I have of Lavinia's have held up pretty well. And there are some, this one, the one with the squares behind me, she definitely used a few different colors for that sort of green color. I haven't actually, pulled any of them apart enough to, peek into the seam allowance to see, how much they faded out. But I think they were mostly made from, if not new goods, maybe goods that were left over from making a garment. So they were not, washed and washed and washed a bunch of times. I can't be sure though.
So I had a question in the comments from Deborah Goodwin. Are all the quilts cotton?
Cotton, yes, they are, all the ones. Although I do have one of Lavinia's quilts, and it's a pineapple, and I don't have it here, but it is made from some kind of satiny silk something. It's much heavier, and it is not lasted as well. So I think it might have been silk. But yes, all the other ones are cotton. I don't know whether that's because those are the ones that survived or whether that's what she worked with the most. It's hard to tell.
Anyone else with a question?
In the chat here, let's see. So Maria says, her son says that the second quilt in the quilts from Anna section looks like the picture of a silicon die computer chip. That's fun. There was a question here about the batting. So I'm just going to mention something that in the quilt, not this one, but in the Lone Star, not the Blazing Star, but the Lone Star that's hanging in the exhibition. When I hold that up to the light, so all these quilts were Southern quilts. And my father used to say that he thought the batting was light because it didn't get that cold down there. I don't know if that's true or not. But when I hold up the regular Lone Star that you see in the very first picture from the exhibit, I can see cotton seeds in the batting. So I don't know if that means that she carded the cotton to make for the batting or whether it was just more normal for there to be some seeds left in the batting back in those days, back 100 years ago. But I love that. And although some of her quilts, there are a couple that are machine pieced, most of them are hand pieced and most of them are hand quilted. And it's a lot of fun for me to look at the quilting that she's done and, look at the patterns that she's chosen to highlight, the different features of the different quilts. That's been a lot of fun for me.
Anne Ribbons asked, have you used pieces of the quilts you inherited in your own work, maybe antique quilts that were in bad shape?
I have not. I have some, in addition to the one quilt of Jane's that I have some fragments that Catherine gave me. And they're really, again, they are just fragments. I know that a lot of folks, a lot of times you'll find pieces of older quilts inside newer old quilts. I haven't taken apart any of these quilts to see. It's not obvious from the outside of them that that's taken place. And I have not used any in any of my work because I don't want to cover them up. I'm still consuming them in their own right before turning them into something else. I'm not sure I ever will because I like to see them. Are any of the quilts labeled? Terry says. They are not. They are not. And that's one of my tasks, is to label them based on what I know about them. You know, I do know that they are from Lavinia, but she did not label any of her work, nor did Jane, at least any of the work that I have.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for all of your time and putting this together. That was wonderful. If you guys are within driving distance, I would definitely encourage you to come out and view the exhibit, which is on view until August 7th. And once again, you can check out Sarah's workshop, which you can find at our website, myartcenter.org. And it's under our online classes. You can find that out there. And we do run other quilting and fiber art programs, including our Quilt Equals Art Equals Quilt exhibition and Quilting by the Lake. So there's lots of quilt-related things that we do at the Schweinfurth. And we just want to thank you all for joining us. And really, that was amazing. Thank you, Sarah.